The 80s had the General. The 90s had John Gilligan. In the noughties, it was the reign of Martin Marlowe Hyland. His was a familiar path with success and power, and then the recklessness. He had to go. Because with him, an innocent young man doing an honest day's work died. Crime World presents Caught in the Crossfire, the unsolved murders of coke kingpin Marlowe Hyland and innocent Anthony Campbell. Available now on all podcast platforms. Do you want me to ask you about your flat tire?
Well,
I know how you love sort of success stories.
Well, it's just, yeah. It's the only practical thing I can do in my life, isn't it? Like, I can change a tyre.
But I want you to do it for me if ever anything should happen, because I haven't a clue.
Yeah, but you see, I've got my 2013 car still has an old spare tyre.
Yeah.
You've some fancy car that you don't even have a spare tyre.
But
you don't even know that you don't have it. You don't. Yeah. It's too posh to even have a spare tyre.
So I'd have some sort of a
self-inflating tyre. Yeah, self-inflating tyre that'll cost 500 or 600 quid. Where I have an old thing that I have to crank up.
But when you say self-inflating, because it's all about me, if I get a flat tyre, does it just blow itself back up again, or do I have to do anything?
I think you have to do something to make it. but I'm not still being stuck in the year 2013. I'm not sure how it works.
Okay.
But because you've got a posh, expensive motor, unlike my humble.
Yeah. Okay. But look, you did
humble love wagon.
Proud.
Yes. Yeah.
And I got you coffee because I just thought.
Yeah. No, you were, but you did express surprise that I could change a tyre, and and you know, I said it to a couple of other people, and both of them were surprised that I could change a tyre. I can drive. I can get it from A to B.
Yeah, but just about.
But both people expressed surprise that I could.
By anyone who can change a tyre.
And people were particularly seemed to be surprised that I could do something practical.
Mm. Did you have to jerk it up and everything and hold it up on one of those thingies? And
yeah. I held it up on one of them thingies after jerking it up. Yeah.
Okay, well, anyway, listen, congratulations.
You brushed past the fact he called his car a love wagon.
Did I, Clodagh? Thank you for that. Yeah. Love wagon. Why?
Well, I was being sarcastic. Of course. No. I mean, it's not. It's if one look at it would tell you it's not a love wagon, is it?
No.
Might be a love repellent, possibly, but love wagon would not suit the style of it, would it?
No, it wouldn't, in fairness. No. You've never had sort of a car that would be a chick magnet.
No. I just have to rely on the old smouldering.
Smouldering good looks. Yeah. As you well. Right, enough of that.
Speaking of smouldering good looks.
Speaking of smouldering good looks, we're going to talk about Dessie O'Hare.
Yeah. Who did actually look well coming out of prison.
Yeah, because he's so fit, right?
Yeah. So
I'll tell you a story about Dessie O'Hare when he was in prison, right?
Yeah.
Somebody I know had this experience with him. This individual was called into a cell one night, into Dessie's cell, and Dessie was telling him a story about the John O'Grady kidnap and the shootout. And as he was telling the story, he started to strip off. Yeah. So the individual I know was getting a little bit worried. Yeah. It was the worst. Stories. But actually, he was just stripping off to show him all the bullet holes in him. Jeez. Because he's like a piece of Swiss cheese. Yeah. Something like 23 bullets. Yeah. And he turned around and, of course, it was a miracle he survived that. The kidnap, of course, was in 1987 of John O'Grady, the dentist whose fingers O'Hare chopped off and delivered to a cathedral during a 27-day kidnap ordeal for him. But so that's sort of O'Hare's party trick as such in prison. And then he doesn't watch telly. Yeah. He does yoga lots of the day and meditates all day and is really zen, serene and popular. They all really liked him. Yeah. He's a kind of an oddity.
He is an oddity because, I mean, his religious sort of sentiments, I think, are very strong, very genuine. And didn't he, of course, famously take a vow of silence in prison for I think he didn't speak for a number of years. I think it was 6 years in total.
No, for sure. And is it that experience? It has to be that. It reminds me of that moment in Reservoir Dogs, when there's the shooting, and of course he survives and gets very religious and decides he's going to, what's the character's name again?
Can't remember.
Anyway, he starts quoting Ezekiel and all this sort of stuff, and he decides he's going to leave a life of crime. But it's the same thing, like he's shot by, this spray, and it goes all around him on the wall, but it's him. So Dessie is a fascinating character.
Yeah, I mean, if you have to look at the context in which Desi O'Hare emerged, he was born in 1956, so the troubles really began in earnest in the early 70s, and he was 16 years old at that stage when he joined the IRA. Famously, we still, I'm sure people in Armagh are sick of hearing it being called Bandit Country.
They don't like that.
No, Bandit Country. But that's...
Big up for the people of Armagh and that as well.
And of course, like but part of the reason why that nickname developed was because of the actions of the IRA in that border area. And the South Armagh Brigade were the most dangerous part of the IRA, and Desi O'Hare from the age of 16 was an extremely active member. They were linked to, that brigade were linked to many, many murders of policemen and also of UDR people, the Ulster Defence Regiment, which was a legal organisation at the time, kind of a reserve force, and they were linked to a lot of those murders. And while he was still in his teen years, he was convicted. I think the first conviction was to do with explosives, and he received a suspended sentence. So he was right at the forefront of that at a very early age.
Very Republican family, wasn't he? Like, he was deeply embedded in the...
Yeah, I mean, if you look at all the flashpoints of republicanism, I think one of his parents was interned during the sort of the border campaign, as it was called, shortly after or during World War II, when the Irish state kind of cracked down on both sides in the border on Republicans, and he was called the Border Fox, I think, for moving between that area, which was famously difficult for the British forces to police. But he had fallings out ultimately with the IRA, and he joined the INLA, and that's kind of where...
He sort of isn't the story that he was almost too chaotic, too hard to control. He wasn't essentially a soldier. He was one of these almost lone wolves that was kind of carrying out operations without any sanction. And the IRA, of course, was a very militaristic body.
Well, it was very militaristic, but if you look back at that stage of it, in the very early stages of it, it probably was far less militaristic than it became. It was a far less disciplined force. It certainly attracted people like Desi O'Hare, who were, wild and reckless and prone to violence. The INLA, of course, were a Republican group as well, an armed Republican group with a socialist leaning, and the INLA sprang out of, I suppose, a split in the IRA, between the officials and the provisional IRA. And the INLA were initially, at least there was a lot of middle class kind of intellectuals involved, but I suppose it descended very quickly into a very violent feud internally within the INLA up in the north, and Desi O'Hare was very much at the centre of that. It became a very, very violent organisation, and the feuding within the INLA was, brutal. There was a lot of people shot. Desi O'Hare was... there was a split organisation called the IPLO, and Desi O'Hare took one side in that feud. He was linked to the murder of a guy called Tony McCluskey, who was suspected of setting up other members of the INLA. And you saw that kind of extreme violence then. Within that feud, people were being tortured, were being mutilated. Eventually, Desi O'Hare went to prison. There was a shootout with police. He drove a car. The car crashed. He broke his legs, and he ended up in prison for an extended period of time. When he got out, there was kind of a change scene, and he sort of became a full-on lone wolf. I think he even had a name for his organisation. I can't even remember what it was, but really it was just Desi O'Hare and a few people he'd grown up with. And they of course then became the kidnapping of John O'Grady.
By the late 1980s, kidnapping was in the air.
It was on, yeah.
You know, that's what it was seen as, a quick book, wasn't it? Even though, it's notoriously difficult to get away with, actually. But I mean, the likes of the Cunningham brothers, John and Michael, were looking at it as their way of making a quick million. They decided they'd kidnap Jennifer Guinness and held her, and there was a shootout, I think, at the end of that on Waterloo Road, and they were jailed. But
yeah, famously, Ben Dunn was kidnapped by the IRA. It was a very controversial thing, even within republicanism, because it was seen as being something that generated hugely bad publicity. But there obviously was a period of time when it still remains a mystery, doesn't it? What was handed over by who in terms of ransoms? But there was definitely ransoms handed over,
and it was the money that they wanted.
It was the money that they.
You know, at that point was probably a lot of it was to fund weapons and other operations. But nonetheless, O'Hare gets involved, and in 1987 he kidnaps the Dublin dentist John O'Grady. As a child, I recall that time and the terror, and it was top of the news, presumably for the 20.
Well, I remembered,
he was held, which was over 3 weeks, and people were being asked to check their outhouses, that he was on the run. He was moving a lot with them, and the police had almost got to them a few times, and then they hadn't. And it went on. And as I said at the beginning of the show, John Grady's two little fingers had been hacked off with a chisel, and they'd been left in a cathedral with the kind of more urgent ransom note. The gang was ultimately traced to a house in Cabra where John O'Grady was rescued, and there was a shootout, but O'Hare fled and went on the run again for another 3 weeks before he was arrested. Now, in the special criminal court, he gave a long sort of almost religious-esque speech from the dock about, his belief set around Ireland, and how the judiciary should be attacked and the police should be attacked, and all the sort of the pillars of the state should be brought down. This was a kidnap. This was a crime. This was not a political act. And I think when he went to jail, he initially went into INLA grouping, but then fell out with them. And by the time the Good Friday Agreement came up, he was in limbo. Now, he got 40 years, but I'm not sure he ever was released. Was he under the peace process, or was he? Did he end?
Well, he applied for release. I think, with Desi O'Hare, the kidnapping of John O'Grady, of course, because he was such an innocent man. I mean, the initial target had been his father-in-law, who was a wealthy businessman, also an innocent man. But John O'Grady was just a regular dentist. And if you look back at the time, I suppose physical force republicanism, as it was termed, like the violence in the north had really there'd been a change in the attitude towards it in over time in the south in particular. And John O'Grady's kidnapping was really seen as an act of horror. And Desi O'Hare was actually, when he was arrested, the INLA disassociated themselves with him publicly. So he went into prison, and he was housed in, I suppose, in Portlaoise Prison in the most high security wings, but he wasn't taken in as one of them. So he ended up kind of mixing in with the gangland criminals to a degree, including people like Eamon Kelly.
Which is where, of course, he became the lifelong friend of Eamon Kelly, in jail at that point for being the first guy to try and smuggle cocaine into Ireland in a particular plot that involved a drug mule travelling from Miami to Dublin, carrying cocaine strapped to her.
Because Eamon Kelly was kind of, in a way, from the same background as Desi O'Hare. Like, he sort of began as a Republican, as an official IRA guy, actually. Not that he was ever a full-on member of the official IRA, but he associated with them. So they kind of came from the same background. And Desi O'Hare, he was the most famous criminal, I suppose, in the country, wasn't he, at the time?
Well, he certainly was, yeah. But Kelly and himself really hit it off. And the thing about them was, they were obviously both had that, anarchy.
Yeah.
going on, that they didn't believe in the pillars of the state or in anything like that. They had that old school republicanism embedded in them. But they were also, while they were dangerous criminals, they were actually family men.
Yes.
Who had sort of devoted to their wives.
Yes, and Eamon Kelly, of course, famously went to Mass all the time as well when he got out.
And maybe that connected them as well, that religious, if at the time Dessie was, spiritual.
So they were kind of, Dessie O'Hare and Eamon Kelly, they both come from that background as well, where I suppose business and crime and they all mixed in together in the world that they inhabited. As I was actually telling you there over lunch, I'm reading Mac Mafia, and that's a book really about, a lot of it is about Eastern Europe and how organised crime and business really are the one. Both Dessie O'Hare and Eamon Kelly, they had that, they mixed in with, criminals, they mixed in with paramilitary figures, and they mixed in with businessmen. And, Eamon Kelly in particular had ties to people that were involved in the building trade, but he also had ties to the drug dealing, and he also had ties to these dissident or these Republican figures as they were at the time.
I think Kelly was a sort of a changing, developing force within organised crime. He'd gone from the sort of the terrorism stroke background into smuggling, and he'd been one of the first really to see the profits to be made from cocaine.
Yeah, and
and then he went on to become, in his latter years, to become a mentor to some of the more prominent cocaine gangs and groupings in the country. But they became firm friends. But Dessie O'Hare was released well before Eamon Kelly. I think Dessie O'Hare would have been.
He was released He was released. He was given sort of temporary release in November 2003.
2003, was it? Yeah. Because sort of the next few years, he's sort of like the news of his release at that point was quite a big story.
Yeah.
And he was kind of in the company of Martin Marlowe Hyland. People were keeping an eye on what he was doing. He, of course, was becoming very religious and, presenting to the world as if he'd left the criminal lifestyle behind him. He went to Medjugorje, where I think Eamon Dillon managed to track him down as he was kind of,
helping pensioners climb the mountain or whatever they do in Medjugorje.
And he went to a retreat in Wicklow, again, this sort of religious, spiritual retreat, but obviously went back to his wife, who he's been with throughout his life and career. But he became, he was definitely in and out of the company of Eamon Kelly as well. And in actual fact, bringing us up to 2012, when Eamon Kelly gets shot dead in quite a shocking murder. He had sort of he had got his bus pass, he'd reached pension age. He looked as if he was on the homeward straight to retirement, with a friendship, a kinship with Christy Kinahan Senior. He was the go-to between the gangs in Ireland and Kinahan Senior. And he was also the mentor of had been Eamon the Don Dunn.
Yeah, he was seen meeting with Eamon the Don Dunn in parks, and used to meet him in open air parks and give him advice. He obviously had a sort of an experience of the logistics of moving drug shipments, and Eamon Kelly was keeping his hand in all of that area. Yeah. Meanwhile, he was a pensioner also. But he was also a pensioner going to Mass every day. Yeah. But what happened, of course, was in around, the start of 2010s, where a new breed of dissident Republican, the real IRA, Alan Ryan's real IRA brigade kind of.
W.
Yeah. they started to put the squeeze on drug dealers, including putting the squeeze on Eamon Kelly. And Eamon Kelly wasn't inclined to pay any money to these sort of young upstarts. And after the murder of Alan Ryan, Eamon Kelly was shot dead by a real IRA operation. And Dessie O'Hare carried his coffin
and gave the eulogy at the funeral. And
again, it was something like the eulogy he gave at his own conviction about Eamon Kelly being a patriot and a soldier for Ireland.
It was quite strange because,
his days of...
How many murders is O'Hare connected to and has almost connected himself to in many cases? Well over 20.
Well over 20. I mean, I think it was 30 something was actually said at one point.
Plus, he's also a notorious torturer.
Yeah.
And, he is a very sinister character. And he's standing at the altar and he's,
eulogizing somebody who, if they were involved in republicanism, was way back in the 1970s and 80s and had been pretty much a professional drug dealer ever since. So it was a strange disconnect even to hear it. Then Desi O'Hare. After that, we do the odd story every now and again. I think we had a story about Dessie O'Hare doing a bit of paving up in the north, didn't we?
And wasn't he selling art, or hadn't he got some sort of a...
I think he was making bow-ons or something and selling them on social media.
Facebook, yeah.
And he was somebody, I think we had a story once about somebody saying they hired a local, up around the border area, they'd hired somebody to do their paving and had spotted Dessie O'Hare. Well, Dessie O'Hare was one of the workers there and they got a bit of a shock.
Yeah, I was up around his house one time. I can't remember whether it was prior or... Yes, I think it was certainly previous to this last sentence he has served. But it's very much in rural Ireland on the border, and it's in Cady, I think, is it?
Cady is where he's from.
There's a lot of kind of mushroom farms at the back of it, and he apparently just gets a bit of labouring work and everything.
Yeah.
But the neatest, most beautifully kept house. You don't expect that really for a notorious terrorist and somebody like him. It's just like the grass is cut, the plant pots, they're planted with the flowers of the season. It's all kept immaculate. And
and it looked like that was his life now. He'd retired up there. He was selling a bit of memorabilia on Facebook and had his own Facebook page, and it looked like that was the end of Dessie O'Hare as a criminal. But I suppose maybe bizarrely or maybe predictably, depending on what you thought of him, he became enmeshed in one of the major gangland stories of the decade when he started working as providing protection, I suppose, for Jim Mansfield Jr.
Do you want me to tell that story briefly and as concisely as I can? So it's May 2015, and Martin Byrne, who is the former head of security he's worked for Jim Mansfield Sr. Jim Mansfield Sr. has passed away, and Junior, his son, is in this absolute mess. He owes money to everybody. When the Mansfield empire went under, they owed a lot of clean money to the banks, but they also accrued a lot of dirty money debts that hadn't kind of washed through their system. Because of course they were money laundering for years. Jim Mansfield Sr. was, for terrorist organisations plus drug gangs. And Mansfield Jr. had tried to untangle it all, and he tried to pay back the debts, but he had got himself into kind of deeper and deeper water. And at this point in May 2015, he has a group of INLA heavies living on his property. And he has had the real IRA in and out using his family home like their office. And everybody's on the payroll.
Yeah.
So in one fell swoop, he decides to bring in Desi O'Hare and his pal, Declan Whacker Duffy. And they're going to clean out all these other paramilitary groups, and they're going to take over the security. So at least he's only one of them to deal with. But it all goes chaotically wrong. Yeah. And Martin Byrne, in the process of this takeover, is kidnapped, and he's threatened. And he manages to, as the police come to the outskirts of the Tasaggart mansion where the Mansfield family lives, he manages to kind of communicate to them that he's in trouble.
Yeah. And
that Desi O'Hare and Whacker Duffy are trying to eject him from his home. And police arrive. There's a chase. I remember at the time, Desi O'Hare and Whacker Duffy took off across the fields. They knew the game was up. They were going to get caught. The Garda helicopter goes up in the air. It runs out of petrol.
Right.
I mean, it's like something out of a movie.
Yeah.
The lads are all eventually rounded up, arrested and placed before the Special Criminal Court, where they all actually nearly pleaded guilty from memory. Whacker Duffy was in trouble because he had been released under the Good Friday Agreement.
He had.
And he had been charged and convicted of murder in the UK.
Yeah.
So when he committed a crime,
it
reactivated that sentence. Yeah. So he had to serve his sentence here in Ireland and then was moved back from memory to the UK to finish off.
He was extradited there now. Yeah.
Desi O'Hare pleaded guilty, and it looked like was the same thing going to happen to him. But there was something about his sentence, that 40-year sentence, that it was either the crime had happened prior to a particular year, or he wasn't officially released under the
terms I think it was that he wasn't released officially under the terms of the Good Friday Agreement. So ultimately he served, I think it was 6 years in Portlaoise Prison and got out this weekend, last week.
Yeah.
And walked out the front door.
Now he's 67.
Yeah.
What's he going to do now?
Well, it's hard.
Not going to talk to the Sunday World, by the way, because he refused.
No, I don't think he has spoken over the years. He certainly posed for pictures at times, but he hasn't sought publicity, I suppose. Look, he's a very unusual character, really. I think he spent, at this point, he spent a huge amount of his life in prison, and he seems to have, while we talk about some guys who really struggle with prison, struggle with the lack of freedom, the boundaries on your behaviour, maybe the lack of living the high life, it doesn't seem to bother Dessie O'Hare, does it, by all accounts?
No,
being in prison.
He seems to be able to be okay in his own head, with his meditation, with his yoga. He doesn't need TV. He doesn't need anything like that. Seems to be a very interesting company, and a great storyteller. But just when you think about it, like 2015, when that last incident happened in May of 2015, that's nearly 10 years ago.
Yeah.
So he was 57.
Yeah.
He's now 67, and that makes a difference. Now, he's not Joe Biden, but he's surely, in gangland terms, coming to the end of
I think his
career.
Well, I mean, that's, as I was saying, I was reading that book about McMafia, and, it's really just talking about how these organised crime paramilitary groups sprung up at the collapse of the Eastern Bloc. But I think Dessie O'Hare is the last of a dying breed. There's not another grouping coming up that are going to take their place. A group of a paramilitary force like that who were able to act as kind of the overlords really of the criminal underworld. They're gone. Where a lot of these guys in the provisional IRA and the INLA at the time, they were able to move between that world of business, that world of politics, that world of crime, and they kind of moved and had an oversight of everything. There's nobody like Dessie O'Hare coming after him. There's no younger soldiers in the INLA coming up to take the place of the guys as they retire. If you look at these, the INLA are still involved in drug dealing and many things like that in the north. But if you look at them all, they're all old men now, really, aren't they?
Would you be scared of Dessie O'Hare?
Well, I mean, I don't think Dessie O'Hare is the type that would start roaring at you and attack you. But he's obviously a unique person that has that in him, and I suppose that doesn't go away.
If you were to consider that he was involved in more than 30 murders, while it would be cloaked in.
Well, there was
militarism. It is essentially a lot of people murdered and killed, and it's mass murder.
It's mass murder. I mean, there's a political context in which these murders occurred. There's certainly a political context in which Dessie O'Hare became involved with the IRA at the age of 16. I mean, there's no doubt about that. But if you look at the that INLA feud that was fought, I mean, it was bloody, vicious. Really, really, people were killing people that they'd known all their lives, and it was. I think that for him to be at the centre of that, I think shows something of the capability he has in him.
And still has, because I would know people now that would not be sort of mild-mannered, shall we say. And they would be very wary of Dessie O'Hare. So he's a very sinister character, and they still believe he would have, certainly he's a very fit guy. Even though he's 67, he'd be probably fitter than me, maybe not you after your incident with the
changing the tyre.
Or whatever. But yeah, I mean, has he got anything left in the tank to...
Well, I mean,
go back at anything again, or is he going to actually retire this time? And is he going to?
I don't think that like if you look at Jim Mansfield, and he brought in the INLA to frighten people effectively into leaving him alone. I don't think that people think of the INLA like that, and like Desi O'Hare. I can't imagine that
Desi O'Hare still has that, he is an INLA terror boss, but I think as an individual, he is a frightening individual. I don't think he needs the INLA to be a powerful force.
No, but
for him to not have that notorious reputation. He's probably the same era and age as Martin the Viper Foley.
He is.
Who is still sort of
using his name
to go and debt collect.
Yeah. Yeah, well, that is a career option available to him. I mean, he is 67, so he can formally, he'll probably go and sign on somewhere and get his old age pension now, which is, a reality, isn't it? But yeah, I mean, look, he is capable probably of anything. But the context in which he became the most feared man in Ireland certainly changes each time he goes into prison and comes out. If we look back, and obviously you've done the podcast about Martin Marlowe Hyland, but he really tried to attach himself to Desi O'Hare because he was such a figure of fear. Just to have, Desi O'Hare in his camp was seen as something that was a good thing to have. I don't think that's going to happen now with the next generation.
I'm just looking at what he was asked when he was confronted by the Sunday World last week. He was asked, did Martin Byrne have anything to fear from him? Martin Byrne being the security officer who gave evidence at the Mansfield trial anyway, Junior, and didn't end up giving evidence because all these people pleaded guilty, but he didn't answer.
No.
And he gave a cold stare.
Yeah, I don't think he was impressed.
I don't think...
And he does, by all accounts, Desi O'Hare, even though he's not a tall or big man, but he does have a presence. People say that when he's in the room, despite the fact he's 67 and 5'6" or 7" or whatever he is.
Well, look, we'll watch this space. I think he has a lot to probably say, and in particular after that, is that spiritual journey real? Like, what does he?
Well, I think it can be. I mean, like if you look, you have to look at...
Anybody who meditates for that many hours a day and is not looking for publicity around it, is doing it privately in a jail cell, must have some connection to...
Yeah, and you have to understand that people, and we don't have to agree, but people viewed themselves as soldiers fighting a war, and that's just the way it is.
Undoubtedly. Okay, Niall, thank you.
Thanks, Nicola.
I'm Nicola Tallant, and you're watching Crime World, a podcast about criminals, drugs and the underworld in Ireland and across the globe. Make sure you subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications so you can be the first to watch all our latest episodes. You can also listen wherever you get your podcasts.